The Christmas Truce occurred on and around Christmas Day 1914, when the sounds of rifles firing and shells exploding were replaced by holiday celebrations in a number of locations along the Western Front during World War I. Soldiers from both sides of the war came out of the trenches during the unofficial ceasefire and exchanged goodwill gestures. This is the story of the brief moment during the Great War where humanity triumphed over senseless violence. The year was 1914, and it was Christmas Eve. Both sides on the Western Front were exhausted from the war and saddened by the prospect of spending Christmas away from their family. Soldiers on one side of the line suddenly began singing Christmas carols to cheer themselves up. They could be heard on the enemy trench, and to everyone's amazement, they decided to join in. German soldiers were spotted erecting lanterns on their trenches. In some cases, Christmas trees and reports of carol singing in the weeks leading up to Christmas on various portions of the British sector of the front. Then, on Christmas Day, wooden signs reading "Merry Christmas" appeared on the German parapet, and German soldiers emerged into no man's land appealing for a truce. Then one thing led to another, and soldiers from both sides appeared to be in no man's land to enjoy the holiday together, kicking off one of the most touching Christmas stories ever told. Many British soldiers were first skeptical, but the truce expanded over time. On both sides, tens of thousands of men took part. Contrary to popular belief, the data shows that the ceasefire only took place in a few areas along the front lines. Officers in charge of their own units were stationed all along the line, and whether or not they would join the ceasefire rested entirely on their festive spirit. Despite what has been depicted in recent films, the truce was limited to the British sector of the front. It's impossible to determine whether this was because British soldiers had a natural affinity for Germans because of their shared history and culture. There was little desire for fraternization on the French front, and while there were a few isolated cases of a truce, the majority of them were tied to burying the dead after a recent battle. Even on the British fronts, many truces were for burial. Local attacks had occurred on certain British fronts, such as the one in Flanders, on December 19, 1914, and the unburied bodies of the dead lay out in no man's land. The smell was horrible, and soldiers wanted to bury their colleagues. Therefore, one of the most typical activities that day was finding and burying your dead, rather than sharing your meals with your enemy. Furthermore, according to some diary entries and letters, the length of the truce varied depending on where you were on the front line. For example, in certain areas, both sides permitted the other to bury their dead on no man's land for only a few hours. For others, the ceasefire was prolonged until New Year's Day, allowing the soldiers to rest and revel in peace. Despite movies and a famous Sainsbury ad, there were no football matches between British and German troops in no man's land on Christmas Day 1914, according to the evidence available. If you thought otherwise, don't be too hard on yourself, because the match that never took place is even commemorated in England with a monument. The nature of the battlefield, with its shell holes and barbed wire, made such a match difficult in the first place. But footballs were used for physical training outside of trenches. Letters from the time suggest a desire to play matches, but the only example that comes close is on the front of the 1/6th Cheshires, where a kickabout took place with around 100 troops from both sides. There are other letters that mention matches taking place in their own trenches, or even reports of promised matches between the Germans and the British. But these were only rumors and suppositions, and nothing came out of them. The story was reported in the press, although there were no first-hand accounts. So there was no organized contest, and Germany did not win. But at the very least, on certain fronts, there was a desire to play football. Soldiers did, in many cases, exchange gifts once the truce was in effect. Opposing soldiers exchanged cap badges and buttons, food and drink, and some took photographs of each other because personal cameras were not outlawed at this point in the war. In no man's land, the 1/6th Cheshires roasted a pig and offered it to their German opponents. German forces presented the men of the 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers with a barrel of beer in exchange for plum puddings. However, the beer was of inferior French quality, and it was not well liked by the tough Welsh regulars. In September of that year, Pope Benedict XV who had recently been anointed, requested that global leaders declare a Christmas ceasefire to allow troops and their families to spend the holidays together. Everyone assumed the war would be over in a matter of months, so he was confident that this ceasefire would finally allow them to see reason and end the carnage. Of course, this did not happen, and the bloodshed continued for another 4 years. However, Pope Benedict XV's influence could have played a factor in the Christmas Truce, as Catholic people all across the world looked up to and listened to the Pope for direction, especially during those days. Although the bulk of British soldiers were not Catholic, a sizable percentage of their Scottish and Irish troops were, as were a sizable percentage of German men and the vast majority of French soldiers. Officials in some places, according to conflicting sources, saw it as treason and executed individuals who left the trenches to make contact with the enemy. The distance between the both sides was so close in some areas of the front line that some officials considered it as a threat because it allowed their subordinates to fraternize with the enemy and know they were only puppets in someone else's game. This was immensely hazardous to the military effort since many soldiers rapidly adopted a philosophy of a live and let live system. On the 25th of December 1914, around 70 British and Commonwealth soldiers were killed or died of wounds along the British front. 32 of them have no known graves and are commemorated on the Le Tourret Memorial, Plugsteed Memorial or Menin Gate. Christmas Day 1914 was a regular day of trench warfare for many men with artillery, random sniper and machine gun fire, and the customary losses. The men of London Rifle Brigade who took part in the Christmas Truce were territorial soldiers from the City of London. Many waiters in London hotels were German before the war, as were a substantial number of men's barbers. One veteran remembered meeting a German soldier who used to trim his hair in no man's land that day. He had been the man's client a few months earlier, but now they were enemies. The nature writer, Henry Williamson, most famous for his 1928 classic, Taka the Otter, was present during the truce at Plugsteert. He felt a kinship with the enemy he met that day because he had German ancestors, and it was a life-changing moment for him. One German soldier told Williamson that he was fighting for king, country and freedom, which he couldn't reconcile with the fact that Williamson was supposedly fighting with the British Army for the same thing. Later in life, Williamson would become depressed on Christmas Day, recalling the truce and the war's horrific loss of life. Why wasn't this an annual event during the 4 years the war lasted, since it was such a heartwarming display of humanity? There are numerous answers to this question. The first is the one we discussed earlier. These amicable exchanges were viewed as a threat to the war effort, and commanders recognized it couldn't happen again. Some of those fortunate survivors of 1914 were to pass 3 more Christmases in the trenches, observing no more broad truces as horrors fostered hatreds. But also generals took pains to stamp out what they feared as a threat to fighting spirit. Another thing to remember is that this was the first Christmas of this dreadful war, which was supposed to have ended in a matter of months. However, technology and the trench system played a role in making this a long and bloody conflict that claimed the lives of millions of people across the world. The longer the troops remained in the trenches, achieving nothing, the more they understood they might never see their families again. The soldiers' enthusiasm and hopes were steadily broken as the conflict proceeded, as seen by their letters and accounts. When all you see around you is devastation and death, who wants to celebrate? While some aspects of the Christmas truce were exaggerated and no football match was played, it was a truly spectacular day. Enemies halted fighting and confronted each other on the battlefield as fellow human beings. Rather than simply following directions, they followed a primal, human impulse. Because the majority of the participants were professional troops, they may have viewed it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take a day off. Others would have been curious to meet a German for the first time, as it was likely that few had. Whatever the reason, it was a one-of-a-kind event in 1914. While the occasional battlefield truce occurred, including one in the winter of 1917-18 in Cambrai, nothing on this size occurred again. Whatever innocence remained in 1914 was lost in the war's epic battles on the Somme and at the Passchendaele. We may argue that it wasn't as magical as we've been made to believe, but during the frigid winter of 1914, many men stopped fighting and met on the battlefield not as enemies, but as fellow men. That's all for today, folks. We hope you have found the video informative, and our whole team would like to wish you all a happy Christmas and holiday.